In the early morning hours of April 19th, 1995, a Gulf War vet named Timothy McVeigh woke up in his Ryder van, where he had spent the night before getting back on the road. Months of planning had gone into his trip to Oklahoma City, but he wasn't moving and he had no intentions to stay long. He was about to commit the largest act of domestic in U.S. history, an attack he believed to be righteous retribution against a government growing more and more comfortable killing its own people. As he made his way to the Oklahoma Capitol, McVeigh reflected on the deaths of Vicky and Sammy Weaver at Ruby Ridge, and of the Branch Davidians in Waco who had lost their lives 2 years earlier to the day. And it was these thoughts that gave him solace as he drove the 7,000-pound ammonium nitrate fuel bomb into downtown Oklahoma City. After locating his target around 9 a.m., he lit the 2 fuses that winded back into the cargo bay of the truck while still driving, before parking alongside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. He knew that the 9-story structure had offices for the ATF, DEA, Secret Service, as well as many other departments of the U.S. government. That and the lack of sufficient security were the reasons that the Murrah building was picked. He was also well aware of America's Children, the daycare within the Murrah building, but he viewed the kids and everyone else inside as necessary collateral damage to send the message that he wanted. He hopped out, locked the truck, and put earplugs in as he walked towards the getaway car that he'd left downtown days earlier. Before reaching his car, at 9:02 a.m., Oklahoma City and America changed forever. The enormity of the blast is almost unimaginable. Support columns in the federal building failed and collapsed, resulting in the concrete floors pancaking and crushing hundreds. Almost instantly, a third of the Murrah building was reduced to rubble. Buildings all over downtown had their windows explode from the shockwave, raining glass and debris onto the people below. Heat from the blast set cars across the street on fire. An enormous crater marked the location where the truck bomb had sat, with little other evidence it had ever existed. And bodies, whole and in pieces, were littered on the ground for blocks. The scene was absolute chaos as first responders sprung into action, the beginning of a 2-week rescue effort. And when it was all said and done, 168 Americans had died in the explosion and over 800 more were injured. The immediate and echoing response was a mixture of outrage, terror, and confusion. Many Americans were left wondering who would do something like this, how could they pull it off, and why? Well, as we will see as we go deeper into the story of the Oklahoma City bombing over a quarter century later, the answers might not be as clear as we'd like. So who was Timothy? Timothy James McVeigh was the middle child of Mickey and William McVeigh, born on April 23, 1968 in Lockport, New York. Not long after his birth, his family moved to Pendleton in upstate New York near Buffalo. The McVeighs were a blue-collar family, with his mother Mildred, also known as Mickey, working as a travel agent, and his father William was a machine operator for General Motors. When he was young, Timothy was said to be outgoing and playful, but as he progressed into adolescence, he began to become more and more withdrawn, and he became known as a shy and nerdy child. And there could be a couple reasons for this change. One is that his home life was always in turmoil. His mother and father's relationship had become a rocky one, with Mildred often leaving home for weeks or months at a time. And this would continue until they finally divorced when Timothy was 16. The other reason could be that he suffered a head injury as a child, which could have had long-lasting effects. At 9 years old, Star Wars came out, something that greatly impacted him. The Jedi-Sith good-bad dynamic was something that he really clung on to. When playing cops and robbers, Tim was always the cop, and when he used his father's golf club tubes and a flashlight to create a lightsaber, he was conquering the imaginary Sith. He would even daydream about being Luke Skywalker, and later in life he would have a similar connection with Star Trek: The Next Generation, which he followed obsessively. He had become accustomed to his mother not coming home for lengths of time, but when he was 11 she left for longer than she usually had, and the unstable family began to fall apart. Needing a stable parental figure and guidance, he looked to his grandpa on his father's side. And this is when he was first introduced to guns, soon becoming a young fanatic of firearms, something many people remember from these years. He started reading gun magazines and going to target practice with Grandpa McVeigh regularly. And it was in the back of these magazines that he got from Grandpa that he would find ads that would expand his reading material on the subject. As he grew into a teen, he was a tall and lanky boy. He tried basketball, which seemed to be fitting, but he was never any good. He was teased about his stature in middle school and high school, picking up the nickname Noodle McVeigh. When he was 17, Noodle McVeigh elevated himself to Patty McVeigh and started flipping them for the local Burger King. He was becoming a man, something that was recognized by an unhappily married regular 10 years his senior. The horny old woman began to flirt with him and come in just to bug the lanky fuck. But Tim was feeling it too, so one day when his father was out of town, she came over to the house to sit on his Noodle McVeigh, and she took his McVirginity out the front door with her when she left. Outside of the pedophilic married woman, the Noodle didn't do very well with his peers, but he proved to be an early adopter of computers and was recognized as the most promising computer programmer his senior year. He also maintained a perfect attendance throughout all 4 years. Despite this, when he graduated high school in 1986, he didn't have very many prospects. Under his photo in the yearbook, he requested the text say, "Take it as it comes, buy a Lamborghini, California girls." Now being out of school, he had most of his days to sit around reading magazines like Guns and Ammo and Soldier of Fortune, skimming the ads in the back for more right-wing text to solidify his worldview. He was well on his way to becoming a bona fide gun and survivalist nut bent on defying the Zionist New World Order. When he wasn't reading, he was renting post-apocalyptic movies to watch on TV. And at this point, Timothy could have become just another gun fanatic, but his life had been priming him to be influenced by certain materials if they were inspiring enough to him. And this is when one of those magazine ads introduced him to a text that would make him into the Timothy McVeigh we know today. It was for a book called The Turner Diaries, a book so poorly written, offensive, and radical that the author refused to put his own name on it. The book is presented in the form of a diary of a man named Earl Turner who gets fed up with stricter and stricter gun laws. In the book, the government, known as the system, is ran by Jews and policed by blacks, both who are terribly tyrannical rapist groups who rule with a liberal ideology where their crimes are not seen as such, as it would be racist to say so. The system begins to enact laws to disarm whites around the country, which is the conflict that Earl Turner must combat. He joins a militia group called the Organization and is then recruited into the Order, the upper echelons of the group. The Order then begins a war against the system by using a truck bomb to blow up the FBI headquarters, killing 700 people and kicking off the revolution. At the end of the book, Earl Turner defeats the last of the leaders of the system, who were held up in the Pentagon, by flying a plane filled with explosives directly into it. Though this is the narrative, it reads much more like a call to action to those who would share in the ideology of hate. It explains in detail how one would run a militia bent on taking down the government. It is a racist, vile instruction manual call to action disguised as fiction, and Timothy McVeigh was obsessed with it. But he isn't the only one that the text spoke to. It inspired a white supremacist bank robber gang in the 1980s who took their name directly from the book, The Order. They modeled their militia on Turner's diary and killed a Jewish radio host who spoke out against white nationalism. Also inspired by the Turner diaries and following in the Order's footsteps, the ARA, or the Aryan Republican Army, would start robbing banks as well in the early 90s. At the time Timothy McVeigh read the Turner diaries, he was already an avid comic collector. He had been spending the little bit of extra money that he made on them as a long-term investment, thinking that they would gain value. He had spent over $1,000 on them at this point, but now he wanted to collect guns instead. When he went to sell his stack of comics, he had a hard time finding any buyers and eventually sold the entire lot to the comic book store that he had bought them from. They gave him a whopping $75. Since his return on investment wasn't going to get him very far into gun collecting, he quit his job flipping burgers and got one as an armed security guard in Buffalo, New York. And he liked the idea of being paid to carry. So after a couple years as a security guard, he decided the best place to do that would be in the Army. The security guard job gave him access to guns, but he was often alone and wanted to feel like he had a purpose and was a part of something bigger. He enlisted in 1988 and attended basic training in Fort Bennings, Georgia. McVeigh talked about the Turner diaries to anybody that he could, even handing out copies to those polite enough to listen to his rants. Most of his fellow soldiers were unimpressed or even offended once they cracked the pages, and they returned his literary gift. Two men, however, felt they connected with its message on the level that McVeigh had, and their names were Michael Fortier and Terry Nichols. Terry Nichols was 10 years older than Tim and the platoon leader. They connected over their love of the Turner diaries and of conspiracy theories in general. They also shared the hardship of coming out of broken homes. After basic training, their company went on to train at Fort Riley, Kansas, where McVeigh turned out to be a great soldier and quite the sharpshooter. He was promoted from private to sergeant in just 2 years. One of his commanding officers even said that with 100 McVeighs at his command, he would be unstoppable. But as good as he was as a soldier, he was off-putting to most of his peers. In 1989, McVeigh and Nichols' friendship would be put on pause as Nichols put in a hardship discharge with the Army and it was granted. An issue had arisen about the arranged child care for his son, and he was needed back on the family farm in Michigan to raise him. In 1991, the Gulf War, also known as Desert Storm, broke out in Iraq. At the command of Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi army was invading Kuwait. McVeigh was shipped out to the Middle East to be a gunner, leaving his only other friend, Michael Fortier, behind in the U.S., who was nursing a shoulder injury. McVeigh was assigned to be a gunner on a Bradley fighting vehicle. It was thought that the Gulf War would last nearly a year, but it ended in about 4 days and would later be dubbed the 100-Hour War. Although the war was short, McVeigh still managed some very memorable moments. In one, he fired a single Bradley shell from 1,000 yards and got 2 kills. For this, he received a Bronze Star. Unfortunately, though, not all of his memorable moments were so dazzling or heroic. During the push of the U.S. Army, most of the unprepared Iraqi soldiers would abandon or surrender when seeing the American troops, but some said that Timothy McVeigh did not accept their surrender. According to 3 others in his troop, McVeigh killed several soldiers while they were being taken into custody. When he returned home, he was given the option to go into Special Forces training. He was fresh off the 100 Hours War and had the chance to get in shape again before, but he refused the break and went straight into the training. And this is where our story starts to diverge into differing accounts. The official story is that the out-of-shape McVeigh washed out of Green Beret training within the first couple days of the 3-week assessment and blamed the Gulf War for his poor performance. He also started to believe that the US was tricked into participating in the Gulf War by the Jewish-backed UN, also known as the New World Order. At this point, he was no longer connecting with anybody in the army over the radical ideas that he picked up a few years before, and he was becoming known as the vaguely racist guy whose house was littered with guns and cats. He quickly became disillusioned with the army and spent the rest of 1991 routing the gun show scene in the US, looking for a new feeling of purpose and belonging. Another go at the Special Forces training was still an option to him, which had been his goal for years, but instead he opted to take an honorable discharge in December of 1991. He started a job as a night shift guard for the Buffalo Zoo and continued traveling the gun show circuit in his time off, hoping to find his new mission in life. At least that's the official story. According to McVeigh, however, things played out differently. After the first few days of Special Forces training, he and 9 others of the 400 potential soldiers were called out from the group using their social security numbers and told that they had scored higher in many tests. Because of this, they were all asked to volunteer for a special unit. They would undergo sheep dipping, a process by which they would pretend to wash out of the armed forces and fall into civilian life. They would go through all the official processes to match, and from there, they would act in a strictly domestic and undercover manner. But McVeigh would be loose-lipped and would let this information out to others, including his sister, in several letters between this time and the bombing. In a sworn deposition after the attack, Terry Nichols also said that Timothy McVeigh told him he was working on behalf of the U.S. Army in clandestine missions. He said McVeigh was very secretive about it, but accidentally let the name of his commanding officer slip one day while they were talking. The name was Larry Potts, lead FBI agent at Ruby Ridge. He was also lead investigator in the OKC bombing, after which Potts was promoted to deputy director of the FBI. And this deposition was sealed, and he was not allowed to be deposed at trial. David Paul Hammer, a fellow inmate of McVeigh's on death row, said he told the same story, that McVeigh was working for somebody that he called the Major, doing black ops. After discussing this publicly, Hammer was placed on lockdown and unable to speak to his attorney. And this all could have very well been some elaborate lie that McVeigh kept going for years, but several strange things seemed to align with this story. First, a curious video would emerge after the attack. It was shot in August 1993 at Camp Grafton, North Dakota, where training in explosives is overseen. A film crew scouting for locations had their cameras rolling and captured a man who looks and sounds a lot like Timothy McVeigh.
So what's your job?
What was that?
What's your job?
I'm a parts clerk.
Oh, you just parking this one, huh?
Yeah, basically.
This clip was shot more than a year and a half after McVeigh's formal discharge from the Army, and according to a U.S. Defense Department record, McVeigh held a DoD secret clearance that did not expire until May 11th of 1995, a month after the attack was carried out. Whether you believe McVeigh was still working in the upper echelons of the U.S. Special Forces or not, much of the remainder of the story plays out the same regardless. After his official honorable discharge, while roaming a gun show, he spotted a pamphlet offering a trial membership to the KKK. He received a White Power t-shirt for signing up for the trial membership, but after its conclusion, he left, stating later that the group was more devoted to their cause of racism than the Second Amendment that wedded his noodle McVeigh. He also said he believed that the KKK were manipulative and harmful to the youth. He started writing into newspapers that published letters to the editor about the decline of America and his growing conspiracy theories. One of them reads as follows: "Crime is so out of control. Criminals have no fear of punishment, prisons are overcrowded, so they know they will not be imprisoned long. This breeds more crime in an escalating cyclic pattern. Taxes are a joke, regardless of what political candidates promise they will increase. More taxes are always the answer to government mismanagement. They mess up, we suffer. Taxes are reaching a cataclysmic level with no slowdown in sight. The American dream of the middle class has all but disappeared, substituted with people struggling just to buy next week's groceries. Heaven forbid their car breaks down. Politicians are out of control. Their yearly salaries are more than an average person will see in a lifetime. They have been entrusted with the power to regulate their own salaries and have grossly violated that trust to live in their own luxury. Racism is on the rise? You'd better believe it. Is this America's frustrations venting themselves? Is it a valid frustration? Who is to blame for the mess? At a point where the world has seen communism falter as an imperfect system to manage people, democracy seems to be headed down the same road. No one is seeing the bigger picture. What is it going to take to open the eyes of our elected officials? America is in serious decline. And while much of what McVeigh says in that letter seems reasonable and rational, a lot of his thoughts were heading down the opposite road. He was beginning to believe that the government was building large crematoriums to support concentration camps being made around the country to house those who spoke out against the government. He thought the UN was a Zionist-backed New World Order, hell-bent on taking guns from Americans. And then something happened that confirmed to him many of the things he was believing. In August of 1992, national news broke about a standoff and a subsequent siege on Ruby Ridge. McVeigh viewed the unlawful killings of Sammy and Vicky Weaver as the first move of the NWO coming for the guns of Americans. He was becoming more and more paranoid, and his regular rants to anybody who was polite enough to give him the time of day were beginning to draw suspicion. One of his coworkers at the zoo even started bringing a tape recorder to work in case there were any specific threats made that he could turn over to authorities. In 1992, Terry Nichols came to Pendleton, New York to visit McVeigh, reigniting their friendship. Nichols had brought along his new Filipino mail-order bride, who McVeigh would later sleep with. After his visit, Terry Nichols went back to his farm in Michigan, and Timothy McVeigh began betting on sports with the little extra money that he had made. But he committed the cardinal sin of gambling addicts, betting on your team. The Buffalo Bills were pretty damn good, even getting to the Super Bowl 4 years in a row between 91 and 94. But they choked like a girl giving her first blowjob every time they made it, making the Bills an unofficial anagram for "Boy, I love losing Super Bowls." After a good season in 92 and a series of successful, albeit smaller bets, Timothy McVeigh put the big money, $1,000, on the Bills to win Super Bowl 26. The Bills would lose to the Washington Redskins 37-24. And after gambling away his small nest egg, Timothy McVeigh decided it was time to leave New York, stating that the taxes were too high. He headed out west to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. While attending a gun show there, he would meet a man named Roger Moore, a wealthy gun dealer and pornographer. The two got along and discussed politics and conspiracy theories. While they were hanging out at the gun show discussing their ideas, a standoff in Waco between the Branch Davidians and the ATF began, the next big confirmation of McVeigh's scatterbrained ideas. McVeigh parted with Roger Moore and headed to Waco, though the two would remain close, with McVeigh staying at Moore's Hot Spring Ranch 3 times over the next year, one of those times even without Roger being there. See, Roger Moore was a married man with many homes spread across the country, but his girlfriend, Karen Anderson, lived out at the ranch. She had become close with many of the men in the gun show circuit and didn't mind the company of another man while Roger was away. In early March of 1993, McVeigh drove his Geo Spectra to the site of the standoff in Waco to see it for himself. Everyone, press included, was being kept back 2 miles from the Branch Davidian compound by the FBI, so many protesters gathered on the largest, closest hill that they could find. McVeigh used the opportunity to set up shop on the roof of his car, selling anti-government bumper stickers and pamphlets to the other protesters who were gathered there and shared in his outrage of what was happening at the Davidian compound.
Just arrived today. I guess somebody told me a lot of people would be scared to put something on, like this.
Out of a few days of living and shopkeeping out of his spectra, well before the conclusion of the events at Waco, he decided it was best to get back on the gun show circuit where he could resell survival gear and copies of the Turner Diaries. So he headed out, hitting one gun show after another, crisscrossing America. He would make just enough money to fund his travels to the next show, totaling 80 in the following years. One of his regular stops between 1993 and 1995 was Kingman, Arizona, to see his old Army buddy Michael Fortier and his wife Lori. The couple would let McVeigh stay with them at their trailer anytime he needed, and even got him a part-time job at a hardware store when he was in town. He would also introduce McVeigh to marijuana and then meth, the latter of which would begin to allow McVeigh to drive cross-country to gun shows without any rest. In April of 1993, he drove to Tulsa, Oklahoma for the world's largest gun and knife show. Tim felt comfortable around the kinds of people who gathered at these events. They could share open conversations about conspiracy theories like the Jewish Reign UN, and he would meet colorful people like Andrea Strassmeyer, aka Andy the German. Strassmeyer was an interesting and possible integral figure in all of this. A German expat and grandson to one of the earliest members of the German Nazi Party. His entire family was filled with German military men, and he immigrated to the U.S. in hopes of working undercover for the U.S. Justice Department, but officially he was denied this opportunity. Eventually, Strassmeyer landed in Elohim City, a 400-acre white supremacist compound in Adair, Oklahoma, that was started by Christian identity pastor Robert Millar in 1973. Elohim was the stomping grounds for racist and anti-government militiamen, and it still exists to this day. 2 of the men that were training with Strassmeyer in Elohim City in 1993 were Michael Brescia and Richard Guthrie Jr., who were both a part of the Midwest Bank Bandits, or the Aryan Republican Army, who robbed 22 banks in the Midwest between 1994 and 1996. It's likely that many or all of the members of the Aryan Republican Army spent time training in Elohim City before later going on to be convicted of violent crimes like murder, bank robbery, the bombing of buildings, and many would have alleged connections to the Oklahoma City bombing. During their first interaction in Tulsa, Strassmeyer and McVeigh realized that they had some shared friends, including Roger Moore, the Florida gun shop owner that he'd met recently, and his girlfriend Karen Anderson, and McVeigh would actually run into Moore and Anderson later at the same gun show. Since bartering was the custom at these gun shows, Andy the German bought Tim's Desert Storm uniform, and the pair became fast friends. Strassmeyer invited McVeigh back to Elohim City to see what was going on there, and he gave him a card with the address and phone number on it. Though no hard evidence ever emerged that he was physically there, phone records show that he had called several times, and witnesses on the property were familiar with McVeigh. There were also 2 separate government informants who had infiltrated Elohim City, who reported seeing him there before the bombing in 1995 as well. Many believe that Timothy McVeigh could have actually been a part of the Midwest Bank Bandits, which would explain a few things, but we'll get to that in a bit. As mentioned before, McVeigh also ran into Roger Moore at the same gun show. The 2 bartered, which consisted of McVeigh trading his white power shirt that he'd gotten with his KKK trial membership to Moore for a smoke grenade and 2 50-feet lengths of fuse. After their transaction, Moore invited McVeigh back to his ranch in Arkansas, a kindness that he accepted. After 10 days in Hot Springs, Arkansas, McVeigh headed north to Decker, Michigan to visit his buddy Terry Nichols on his family farm. At this point, Nichols and his brother had renounced their U.S. citizenship. Terry was now deep in debt for child support and claimed that his citizenship renouncement was because the fraudulent Federal Reserve actually owed him money since they'd abandoned the gold and silver standard. Tim decided to hang out there for a while, and during this time, he figured out that he could get Nichols to do pretty much whatever he wanted. A couple things made this apparent. First, after Nichols claimed he regretted not being a part of the Gulf War, he allowed Tim to simulate it there on the farm, taking him out into a field and shooting at his feet, making him dance like an old-time Western. Probably the more significant indication of Terry Nichols' submission to McVeigh was the fact that McVeigh slept with his mail-order wife and the mother of his children during that same trip, and it didn't even seem to put a kink in their friendship. Timothy McVeigh was still on the Nichols farm in April of 1993 when the Waco siege came to its fiery conclusion and the ATF raised their flag over the remains of the compound. McVeigh's frustrations with his own government had reached a boiling point. When he got back on the gun show scene, he had changed what he was selling to take advantage of the outrage of the Waco siege. He was selling shirts that said Federal Bureau of Incineration, ATF hats with bullet holes punched in them, and copies of a video called Waco the Big Lie. The people he was now surrounding himself with were receptive to his rants about America needing a change and taking radical action. Inspired by the Turner Diaries, he began to fantasize about how one would go about it. But like Earl Turner, he would need allies, he would need funding, and he would need materials. In June of 1993, he moved to Kingman, Arizona to spend more time with Michael Fortier, and he began making ties with the Mojave Desert militia group known as the Arizona Patriots. Michael Fortier got him a job at the True Value Hardware loading lumber, and gave McVeigh a place to crash and receive mail for the next 4 months while he made connections. At night, the two would smoke meth together and talk conspiracy theories, including one that they had heard about the local National Guard storing guillotines that they would soon use on gun-owning Americans. While twacked out one night, the two even broke into the National Guard armory in Kingman, thinking they'd find the guillotines and large stashes of weapons that they could steal. They actually got in, but they didn't find any guillotines or weapons for that matter, so they stole an axe and a shovel and a couple other domestic items before they were scared off by a security guard's flashlight. The two also started to experiment with black powder pipe bombs in the Arizona desert in early July. In September of 1993, McVeigh headed back to Decker, Michigan to live and work with Terry Nichols on the family farm during the fall. Around this time, the plan to stockpile materials for bomb making begins to solidify in McVeigh's mind. He and Terry Nichols start making pipe bombs on the property, but their results are underwhelming. They attempted to use one to blow up a large boulder on the property, and it was a complete failure. But officially, these two somehow would make one of the largest truck bombs ever seen by humanity, just under 2 years later. At the end of 1993, McVeigh also started to go to hobby shops around Michigan to buy nitromethane model airplane fuel under the alias Terry Tuttle. But while he was staying on the farm and shopping for supplies, tragedy would strike. On November 22, 1993, Terry's 2-year-old son suffocated on a plastic bag that he'd somehow gotten over his head. Police ruled it an accident, but Terry and his wife still decided to leave the ranch, moving around throughout the Midwest before landing in Kansas 6 months later. McVeigh stayed in Michigan for a few more months, but after not being able to find work, decided to get out of town himself. For about a year, he bounced between Arizona, Kansas, and Michigan. In May of 1994, just under a year before the bombing, Nichols and his wife landed on a ranch in Marion, Kansas. For months, the two worked tirelessly there on the ranch and were described as good workers. In July, McVeigh was the best man at the wedding of Michael and Lori Fortier before heading to Kansas in August of 1994. Shortly after he arrived, he convinced Terry Nichols to rob the Marion Quarry, and at 2 a.m. on August 30th, 1994, they drove 2 cars and robbed the place blind. They took 350 pounds of explosive gel, 299 sticks of dynamite, 600 blasting caps, and a stash of Primadeck cord. They filled both vehicles with their loot just in case one of them was pulled over on the way back to Kingman, Arizona, where Michael Fortier had been assigned to rent a storage locker for the stash. Once they got there, however, they discovered that Fortier had forgotten to play his part, so they drove the explosives to Flagstaff temporarily. McVeigh and Nichols spent about 3 weeks driving around Kansas to buy large quantities of fertilizer from feed stores and living out of Terry Nichols' truck at Geary State Lake. On September 13, 1994, the assault weapons ban signed by President Clinton went into effect, which, according to McVeigh, would be his last straw. They were now officially coming after the guns of Americans. In October of '94, Nichols finally returned to the ranch in Marion, Kansas, but without much warning he announced to his boss that he'd be moving to Arizona to sell guns. Instead, with the assistance of McVeigh, he moved in the middle of the night to Harrington, Kansas, just 30 miles away. He also sold a large amount of gold that he had and gave the money to McVeigh, which he would use to purchase 3 drums of nitromethane from VP Racing in Dallas for $950 each, and several plastic barrels in Florence, Kansas. And then the two began to devise a plan to rob gun dealer Roger Moore at his Hot Springs ranch to continue to fund their burgeoning venture. On November 4th, 1994, Roger Moore and his girlfriend Karen Anderson were out at the Hot Springs Ranch preparing for Anderson to attend a gun show in Shreveport, Louisiana the next day. At 6 a.m. the following morning, Karen left for the gun show, and Roger got up at 9. When he stepped out back to feed the livestock, he was greeted by a man dressed in fatigues, wearing a ski mask, and holding a pistol-grip shotgun and a garrote wire in the other hand. After forcing Moore back in his home and handcuffing him, the robber began to loot the house. He clearly had inside knowledge of what was there and where it was located. He quickly gathered up all the guns, cash, precious metals, and jewels within the home and loaded them in Moore's van. During the heist, Roger had complained that he was losing feeling in his hands due to the tight cuffs, and the robber obliged him by rebinding him with duct tape. In all, the thief made off with $8,700 in cash, 66 firearms, gold bars, silver bullion, Moore's safety deposit box key, and many other valuables. Roger Moore eventually worked himself free before heading next door to call the cops, as the assailant had cut his phone line. He told the police that he had no doubt the robbery had something to do with a man named Timothy McVeigh, who he apparently had a recent falling out with. He did admit, though, that the man was much shorter than McVeigh and had a mustache and possibly a goatee, though it was hard to tell under the mask. During the robbery, McVeigh was attending a gun show in Akron, Ohio, and then spent a month in New York after the death of his grandfather. Later, Roger Moore would admit that the robber couldn't have been Nichols either, for he was known to be clean-shaven and much smaller in stature than the attacker. To this day, it's unknown exactly who robbed Roger Moore, but later Robert Millar, leader of Elohim City, would admit that Michael Brescia, ARA member and roommate of Andrea Strassmeyer at Elohim City, helped with the robbery in Hot Springs. And this was in the height of the bank heist that the ARA were pulling. Around this time, McVeigh also wrote a letter to his sister with 3 sequential $100 bills, which he explained that he'd gotten from committing a bank robbery, so there's a good chance McVeigh was a part of the whole Midwest bank bandits run. There's also been speculation that Roger Moore, Karen Anderson, or both were in on their own robbery as a way to launder money to McVeigh and his allies for the Oklahoma City bombing. The guns that were taken were stored in a storage locker rented by Terry Nichols in Council Grove, Kansas. Nichols was staying nearby at a room in the Travelers Motel in Manhattan, Kansas. The locker and the motel room were rented under the same name, Ted Parker, who had Michigan plates. From there, he called McVeigh to tell him that the robbery went well, and he mailed him $2,000 cash in 100s. He also went across the street and made 6 phone calls to an unknown number. In December of 1994, McVeigh left New York after helping with the estate sale of his grandfather's belongings and went back to Decker, Michigan, where he continued to practice bomb making, but with a family friend of the Nichols named Kevin Nicholas. McVeigh is still not very good at it, but he begins to brag to others that he's getting better. He also started to go to meetings with Nicholas for a paramilitary group known as the Michigan Militia. While in Decker, he received another letter from Terry which contained a key and a combination to the Council Grove storage locker. He then drove from Michigan to Arizona to pick up Michael Fortier. Lori Fortier helped McVeigh create a fake ID that he could use later to check into a motel before the bombing. McVeigh and Fortier then headed to the storage locker in Council Grove to pick up the guns that were stolen from Roger Moore. On the way, they stopped off in Oklahoma City to scout the Murrah Building that he planned on bombing, driving around the location twice and pinpointing vulnerabilities. Then they continued on to Council Grove, where they rented a second vehicle. They loaded the car up with about 30 guns, after which Fortier drove it back to Kingman, Arizona, and was told that he could keep half the profits from selling the weapons. He and his wife, Lori, both played a role in the planning stages of what was to come. McVeigh returned to Michigan to stay with Kevin Nichols with several of the stolen guns. He began to go around to gun shows in the state and sell off what he had brought back, and Michael Fortier was in Arizona doing the same. On January 19, 1995, just 3 months before the bombing, James Nichols, Terry's brother, transferred the deed of his 1983 Pontiac station wagon to Timothy McVeigh. This was intended to be the getaway car that McVeigh would use in Oklahoma City, and he drove it down to Kingman, Arizona to meet up with Fortier. The pair went to Reno in February, where they sold off more of the stolen weapons at a gun show there. In March, the leaders of the Michigan Militia, the Arizona Patriots, and other far-right groups began to talk of a revenge plot for the events at Waco 2 years earlier. At least a dozen other leaders of right-wing groups around the country also spoke of a national tragedy that would occur as revenge on the 10th anniversary for the raid of the CSA compound, and as retribution for a man named Richard Snell's execution, which had been scheduled for April 19, 1995. And I guess now is as good a time as any to get into Richard Snell and the CSA, but to do so we have to go back 12 years. In the early 80s, there was another compound very similar to Elohim City, located in northern Arkansas, called the Covenant, Sword, and Arm of the Lord, or the CSA. It began as a Christian identity group but quickly grew into something more nefarious, becoming a violent hate group that believed that Jewish people were descendants of Satan. They had planned to take the model of the radical leftists in the 60s and use crime to fund their mission in the 80s. The domestic terrorist group flourished there in the foothills, training and stockpiling weapons and explosives. An Oklahoma man named Richard Snell was a member of the CSA and of the Aryan Nation, with grievances against the IRS, and in 1983 he hatched up a plan to bomb the Murrah Building with a truck bomb. Snell and other CSA members cased the location and saw the lack of security, but his plan to use a van filled with explosives was shot down by the leader, James Ellison, who wanted to build a rocket launcher to blast the structure with instead. but all plans to attack the building went up in smoke when their homemade rocket launcher exploded during its creation, killing 2 men. Both Snell and Ellison saw it as divine intervention and moved away from the Murrah building plans. Later that year, Snell killed a pawn shop owner in Texarkana that he mistakenly believed to be Jewish. In 1984, he murdered an Arkansas state trooper that pulled him over for being black and then fled to Oklahoma where he was caught. He showed zero remorse during court and even said that he would do it all again if he had the chance. Soon after he was convicted and given the death sentence, Operation Clean Sweep, a vast operation targeting right-wing militia groups in the U.S., began on April 19, 1985, when federal agents surrounded the CSA compound. The raid didn't go as planned, though, and resulted in a standoff. The FBI contacted Robert Millar, leader of the Oklahoma separatist compound called Elohim City in Oklahoma, to ask him for help. And with Millar on board, they convinced the CSA to surrender, and the largest catch of guns and explosives ever seized was found on the property. And Operation Clean Sweep continued around the country. Charges of robbery, assassination attempts, bombing plots, and mass shooting plans were levied in a large sedition trial against many right-wing leaders at the time. 14 of them would end up defendants in the Fort Smith trial in 1988, with many others turning state's witness. One of the men who flipped was CSA founder James E. Ellison, who revealed the 1983 plot to attack the Murrah building that had been cooked up by Richard Snell. During the trial, the jury didn't see the witnesses as credible, as they were all white supremacist extremists. And because of this, all the men on trial were found not guilty and released. After the leader of the CSA tried to burn its own members to save his skin, his following abandoned him and moved to Elohim City to regroup and plan for their war against the US government. Now let's fast forward back to within a month of the 1995 Oklahoma City attack. On March 31st, McVeigh checked into the Imperial Motel in Kingman, Arizona, paying for 12 days in advance. A few days later, on April 3rd, Michael Fortier and his wife would sell off the remainder of the stolen guns at a Tucson gun show. On April 5th, McVeigh called a Ryder truck rental dealership in Lake Havasu from the Imperial Motel to ask about rental rates. Immediately after, he called Robert Millar's number in Elohim City. The call was answered by Millar's daughter-in-law, who said McVeigh was asking for Andrea Strassmeyer. 5 days later, an interesting thing would happen at a strip club in Tulsa, Oklahoma, called Lady Godiva's. Witnesses claimed to see someone matching McVeigh's description, with a buck-toothed man who had a German accent, and a third man who was short, stocky, and had olive skin, the same description that would later be given for John Doe number 2. The 2 men that were with McVeigh were likely Andrea Strassmeyer and Michael Brescia. And this whole meeting would have probably passed as uneventful had McVeigh not bragged to a cocktail waitress of his plans. He told her come April 19, 1995, that she'd never forget his name. The waitress thought this was so odd that she went into the changing room and told a couple of her friends, an interaction that was fortunately caught on tape.
I'm a very smart man. I said, you are? And he goes, yeah. And you're going to remember me on April of 1995. You're going to remember me for the rest of your life.
2 days later, on April 12th, just a week before the bombing, he would check out of the Imperial Motel at 10 a.m. and begin his 1,000-mile trip from Kingman, Arizona to Junction City, Kansas. He barely made it into town as the station wagon he'd gotten from James Nichols broke down on the edge of town. He made adjustments on April 14th when he traded in the station wagon and $250 cash to a Firestone tire dealer for a yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis. Knowing he wouldn't need it long, McVeigh just threw the old Arizona tag from the station wagon on his new beater and drove it to the Dreamland Motel. Despite having the fake ID that Lori Fortier helped him make, he checked into the hotel under his real name and used the address of the Nichols farm in Michigan. He also called Elliott's body shop, who rented Ryder trucks, where he would ultimately rent his vehicle. On Sunday, April 15th, a food order was called into the hotel room from the Hunan Palace restaurant. The name on the order was Bob Kling. When the delivery driver arrived, somebody who wasn't Timothy McVeigh answered the door and paid the delivery man. The driver would later say that whoever answered the door wasn't any of McVeigh's known accomplices either. The next day, the 16th, McVeigh drove his getaway car to downtown Oklahoma City. He left a note in the window that read as follows: "Not abandoned. Please do not tow. Will move by April 23rd. Needs battery and cables." Then he called Terry Nichols in Kansas and told him that he needed to come pick him up there in Oklahoma City and take him back to his motel room in Junction City, Kansas, a 550-mile round trip. And without question, Nichols agreed. It's honestly hard to say how much Terry Nichols knew at this point, but he would later tell authorities that on the trip back, McVeigh told him something big is about to happen. Terry asked him if he meant a bank robbery, to which McVeigh just repeated, "Something big." The pair arrived back at the Dreamland Motel at 1:30 a.m. the next morning, and Terry Nichols drove back to his home in Harrington directly after. Later that afternoon, McVeigh is seen on a security camera at a Junction City McDonald's. Shortly after, two men show up at Elliott's body shop nearby. One of them fits McVeigh's description, and the other would be labeled as John Doe number 2 by authorities. McVeigh requested a truck with a 5,000-pound payload and provided the fake ID that Lori Fortier had made him to complete the transaction. The name on it was Robert Kling, the same name used on the food order back at the hotel room, and it had a birthday of April 19th, 1970. The two men drove the truck and the Mercury Marquis back to the Dreamland Motel and parked the Ryder truck as far from the room as they could. According to records, McVeigh phoned Elohim City afterwards, apparently to secure a place to hide out after the attack. At 8 p.m. that evening, a man matching the description of John Doe number 2 would check into a separate motel room for a single night just a mile down the road at the Great Western Inn. In the early hours of April 18th, just a day before the bombing, McVeigh leaves the motel room in the Ryder van. At 6 a.m. he rings Nichols and tells him to meet him at the storage unit in Harrington, Kansas, where the bomb materials were being stored. They fill the truck and drive to Geary Lake to assemble the bomb. The 7,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel were arranged in a U-shape to direct the blast. The payload would be ignited by 2 lengths of fuse which ran back into the cab. McVeigh, Nichols, and whoever else was there finished up before noon, and Terry Nichols took off. McVeigh, and likely John Doe number 2, travel to northern Oklahoma, where they stop and sleep for the night in the Ryder truck. On April 19th at dawn, the truck pulls off and heads towards downtown Oklahoma City and is spotted on the Regency Tower security camera traveling to the Murrah Building. More than 20 witnesses claim to have seen McVeigh with another man, dark skin, shorter, both while the two were en route and exiting the vehicle. As I've already mentioned, the second man would later be referred to as John Doe number 2. Hundreds went in and out of the Murrah Federal Building every day to perform payments and other municipal activities, and McVeigh wanted to detonate his bomb during the day to send a message, racking up the highest body count possible. He compared those in the building to those working in the Death Star and likened himself to Luke Skywalker in that moment. But 138 of the 168 who would die that day had nothing to do with law enforcement. The plan had been to park the Ryder truck in the underground parking structure beneath the Murrah Building, which would have been far more catastrophic if you can even imagine. But McVeigh and his cohorts had made a crucial mistake. The clearance on the Ryder truck was too high to get in, and they spent 15 to 20 minutes attempting to get the moving truck into the underground lot before panicking and coming up with a plan B. Next, he tried the alley nearby alongside the building, but upon seeing a cop car parked there, he backed out and spotted his third option right up front alongside the Murrah building in a handicapped parking space. A total of 24 people later interviewed by the FBI told agents that they saw McVeigh with someone else. One man gave McVeigh directions to 5th and Harvey and saw the second man sitting in the Ryder truck. Several others claimed to have seen the Ryder truck driving in a caravan with the marquee, a brown truck, and a van, made more noticeable as the group failed to get into the parking structure. If true, it's likely that the people driving the other vehicles were McVeigh's bank robber ARA buddies. After deciding on the handicapped spot, McVeigh rounded the block just before 9 a.m. and he pulled the Ryder truck over to light the first fuse of the 3.5-ton bomb. While at a stoplight, he lit the second fuse before pulling up next to the building, getting out, and walking towards his getaway car while putting in earplugs. Moments later, John Doe number 2 exited the passenger side and began walking away before returning to the cab once more and then abandoning the bomb for good. At 9:02, the truck bomb detonated well before McVeigh could get to his car. Ceiling tiles fell from ceilings up to 3 miles away, and buildings all over downtown had their windows explode from the force. Many of the injured were hurt by large pieces of falling glass, and several of the surrounding buildings were so badly damaged that they had to be demolished later. The rear axle of the Ryder truck, a 250-pound piece of steel, was launched 2 blocks away, hitting a car driven by a family who barely survived. A third of the Murrah building crumbled as the support columns collapsed. The concrete floors pancaked, leaving large bloody stains on the floors and ceilings where the people were just moments before. Cars across the street from the bomb burst into flames. Just a couple floors up where Timothy McVeigh parked the truck was the building's daycare, America's Children. Of the 21 who were there that day, only 6 survived, and another 4 kids in the building would also die. One woman survived a 5-story fall before being trapped under rubble. The woman managed to survive by finding comfort in holding the severed hand that came to rest near her. At the time of the bombing, another woman named Dana Bradley was at the Social Security office with her baby, her mother, daughter, and sister. When the bomb went off, she instantly lost her mother and both of her kids. Her sister suffered severe burns, and Dana was pinned under rubble and had to have her leg amputated with a pocket knife. Many of the lucky survivors ended up in the basement, which became known as the pit because it was slowly filling with cold water from burst pipes. The ATF office and its evidence room had collapsed into the carnage, and the evidence room had been filled with piles of seized money and guns. After the blast, these piles were dispersed like confetti and spread over the large blast zone. Responders chaotically scavenged amongst the fallen cash and firearms to find anybody who had survived. Meanwhile, Timothy McVeigh was struggling to get his getaway car started. After 20 minutes of trying, the engine finally turned over and he began to head out of town. Accidentally or intentionally, McVeigh had forgotten to put the Arizona license plate back on his car, and it's not known why he took it back off in the first place. Less than an hour and a half after the bombing, McVeigh would be pulled over on I-95 just 89 miles from Oklahoma City for driving without a license plate. The state trooper spotted the infraction about 60 miles north of Oklahoma City and pulled him over. When he noticed a bulge in his jacket, he reached inside and pulled out a handgun. Timothy McVeigh was arrested for the first time in his life for the unlawful carrying of a firearm and for driving without a license plate. When he was arrested, he was wearing a Sic Semper Tyrannis t-shirt, which meant "Thus ever to tyrants," and on the back of the shirt was a quote from Thomas Jefferson: "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." On the dash of his car were pages torn out from the Turner diary that seemed to be staged, especially since it isn't a car that he owned long. And meanwhile, it seemed there was foreknowledge of the event in more than one place. In Arkansas, Robert Millar, head of Elohim City, had called for a violent protest if Richard Snell was executed on Patriots' Day. Prison guard Alan Abel said Snell predicted a catastrophic event, as well as saying that sometime in the next 10 days there would be hell to pay, which was recorded in his death watch log. Prison logs from April 19th at 12:20 p.m. state that Richard Snell was in the presence of his spiritual advisor, Reverend Robert Millar, when he asked that the television news be turned on. The log states that when he saw the bombing of Oklahoma City, he began smiling and chuckling. A plan that he had come up with in 1983 had finally come to fruition. And all the way in Spokane, Washington, a manager at a motel there said 45 minutes before the bombing, Chevy Kehoe, a former resident of Elohim City, asked to have the motel lobby's television turned to CNN. According to the manager, quote, days before that, he had mentioned to me that there's going to be something happening on the 19th and it's going to wake people up. The manager described Kehoe as ecstatic when the bombing was announced on television. "It's about time," Kehoe reportedly exclaimed. And there even seemed to be evidence that those you wouldn't expect knew something was going to happen. A witness there the day of the bombing in Oklahoma City asked an ATF agent on the scene if his office was in the building, to which he said yes. Then the witness asked if any agents were in the building, to which he was told no, they weren't there. Another witness had a similar encounter with an ATF agent who told them that they'd been tipped by a pager not to come in that day. McVeigh had selected the building for its vulnerabilities. He had cased the place multiple times and knew the building only ever had a single security guard to keep watch. And not just that, the building was actually entirely unguarded for 5 hours a day, a huge reason that the building was targeted over others in Dallas and Omaha. The security cameras lining the building were also fake and not hooked up to a recording system. There's no way Timothy McVeigh knew this, but it was known to Federal Protective Services, whose director had complained several times in the previous years about the security gaps in the building, actually leading to a formal report. He was eventually written off entirely, though, and told to rewrite the report. After the bombing in '95, he was relocated far away from Oklahoma City so that the federal incompetence wouldn't come to light. Furthermore, penny pinching by the government contributed to how bad the damage was. When the federal building was constructed, rebar was used in the columns to save money, but for less than $18,000 more, something like a third of 1% of the entire budget. The Muir building could have implemented hoop steel in the columns instead, and the building would not have collapsed. It's been estimated that if hoop steel was used, the casualties would have dropped from 168 down to under 25. But of course that's not what happened, and the rescue attempts lasted for 2 weeks before finally being called off. But it wouldn't take nearly that long for police to realize they already had their suspect in custody. Almost immediately, criminal psychologists put together a profile that was spot on. A military man, white, in their mid-20s or 30s, who was upset about Ruby Ridge and Waco. The first break came when the VIN number was pulled off the rear axle of the Ryder truck that had landed blocks from the blast. It was traced back to Elliott's body shop in Ocean City, Kansas. They pulled the paperwork for the rental and it came back under a man named Robert Kling, the alias used by McVeigh. When the employees at the body shop were interviewed, there seemed to be a consensus that McVeigh was not alone. As I said, 2 men had rented the truck. Sketches were made using the employees' descriptions. One was definitely McVeigh, but the second, who has infamously become known only as John Doe No. 2, was a heavier set man with olive skin. Sketches were taken around Junction City until one sketch was recognized by an employee at the Dreamland Motel on Friday, April 21st. After checking their records, they found that the man that they recognized had rented a room under the name Timothy McVeigh. The address he provided traced back to a farm in Decker, Michigan, about 90 miles north of Detroit. The farm belonged to a man named James Nichols. Authorities quickly looked into this Timothy McVeigh and found that he perfectly matched their profile, and he had ties to James Nichols through his brother Terry. Just 2 days after the bombing, things were beginning to fall into place. Better still, after running the suspect's name through their computer database, authorities found that Timothy McVeigh had already been arrested on Wednesday, the day of the bombing, on unrelated misdemeanor charges, and he was sitting in a Noble County jail. After he'd been arrested, his bail hearing had actually been set for the next day, but due to a stroke of absolute luck, the docket had filled up and it was pushed to Friday, the day that all this was being put together. Had his hearing not been delayed, McVeigh would have bailed out and been on the run. Federal law enforcement went there and picked up McVeigh that day, and as they hauled him off, he was expressionless and without remorse. Nichols would also turn himself in that afternoon after hearing his name on the radio as a suspect. He was questioned for 9 hours before being charged with involuntary manslaughter and conspiracy. Michael and Lori Fortier denied knowledge of the plot and even showed public support for McVeigh's innocence, at least at first.
Everybody should be supportive of him because he's an innocent man.
His charade didn't last long, and after discovering he too was being implicated, he changed his story and agreed to testify against McVeigh and Nichols in exchange for a lighter sentence. On June 2, 1997, after 23 hours of deliberation, McVeigh was convicted on 15 counts of murder and conspiracy. McVeigh sat emotionless as the verdict was read, and on August 14th, under the unanimous recommendation of the jury, he was sentenced to die by lethal injection. 6 months later, in a federal trial, Nichols was convicted of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter, but he avoided murder charges and the death penalty. His trial hadn't been so clean-cut, as the initial verdict came back 10-2 to acquit, which may have been due to some witnesses who were barred from McVeigh's trial being allowed to speak. But after re-examining the evidence, the same jury handed down a verdict that would land Terry Nichols in prison for the rest of his life. On December 13, 2000, McVeigh requested an end to all of his appeals and asked to be executed within 120 days. He publicly took sole responsibility for the bombing and was sentenced to die on May 16, 2001. But just 9 days before his scheduled execution, something happened. FBI agent and inspector in charge of the Oklahoma City case came forward saying that there had been problems in the discovery of the case. He revealed that the FBI failed to turn over 4,000 documents, including many with references to an unsub number 2. McVeigh's execution was delayed for a month, and his defense attorneys claimed that there was proof that others besides Nichols and McVeigh were involved, and that the FBI had prior knowledge of a plot. They then requested that his execution be stayed, saying that with proper discovery there is reason to believe that a nexus between McVeigh and these other mysterious individuals will be established, but it was denied. And on June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was pronounced dead at 7:14 a.m. Central Time. Normally, I like to provide a pretty complete picture of the events that I'm speaking on, but with the Oklahoma City bombing, I'm afraid that I can't. What I can provide to you is a number of strange details and oddities that point away from the official narrative. A man named Dennis Mahon regularly frequented Elohim City. He was barred from entering Canada and the UK as a suspected international terrorist threat, and he had a friendship with McVeigh after meeting him at a gun show. He was the leader of the White Aryan Resistance, or WAR, which had a history of anti-government activity and race crimes. Mahon would become romantically involved with a Tulsa socialite named Carol Howe. After she was attacked by a group of black youths, she turned towards rebellion from society and racism. The two had a rocky relationship, and when Howe pressed rape charges against Mahon, the ATF saw it as an opportunity. She became an undercover informant for the government and was directed to gather information on Strassmeyer and Elohim City. In December of 1994, she reported that Andreas Strassmeyer was very open about his plans to bomb a federal building. She also informed them that Strassmeyer was an illegal alien and not permitted to carry a firearm. During her time at Elohim, she sat for a sermon with Robert Millar, where he instructed his troops to take action against the government, especially the ATF, and after that they would soon begin war with the US government. She also said that she'd heard of plans for the following April and of a bombing. This was all reported to the ATF, and based on the information provided by Howe, they performed a surveillance flyover on February 7, 1995 of Elohim City to gather information for an upcoming raid. But the plan was discarded when the FBI persuaded them to call it off in fears of another Waco situation. Soon after that, despite her willingness to give information that seemed credible, she was deemed unreliable for some reason, and communication was cut with the ATF. After the bombing, Carol Howe became vocal. Her and her handler, Angela Finley, reported to the FBI headquarters in Oklahoma City. Howe reported that several people who frequent Elohim, including Strassmeyer and Mahon, had made several trips to scout the federal building in Oklahoma City. She said they were planning to use violence and was certain that McVeigh was there in this time frame. Phone calls between McVeigh and someone at Elohim were confirmed by the calling card being used by McVeigh at the time. Suddenly, she was initiated as an asset once again, but for the FBI, and documents suggest that she was instructed to go back to Elohim and identify or locate John Doe number 2. When she reported back, she said there was some big secret going around and that there was an open support for the bombing. During her time there, Richard Snell's body, after his execution, was brought back and buried there. Snell was never questioned about what he might have known about the bombing because he was put to death 12 hours after the blast. Carol Howe's ex, Dennis Mahon, also asked her while she was there to provide an alibi for him on the 19th. She told the FBI and the ATF this soon after, but refused to go back to Elohim. Someone apparently had warned her that she was suspected of being a rat, and she feared for her life. Soon after that, the investigation into Elohim was dropped, but the FBI continued to look for John Doe number 2. But eventually, 2 years after the investigation began, it ended with all others unknown having charges dropped. When Carol Howe's name came out in discovery for McVeigh's trial, charges were suddenly pressed on her for having an explosive device in her house, and she was raided. She was not allowed to testify at the trial of Timothy McVeigh, but she was almost involved in Terry Nichols' trial. She knew far too much to risk being a credible witness on the stand. Still, she was called by the defense anyways, but when she got to Denver for the trial, the judge disallowed her testimony and didn't let her speak. She alone knew enough to sow doubt into the official narrative and make people wonder why the ATF hadn't done more to stop the attack. There's a good chance that McVeigh was robbing banks with the Aryan Republican Army, and that the Aryan Republican Army helped McVeigh with his project. The ARA was born when Peter Langan and Richard Guthrie were convinced by Mark Thomas, a KKK leader, to start robbing banks. After a few successful robberies, they went back to Thomas in search for new recruits. In turn, Thomas put them in touch with Scott Stedford and Kevin McCarthy, 2 young Philadelphia skinheads who had played together in a Nazi punk band called Cyanide. They would later bring in another member of their band, a man named Michael Brescia. The crew operated for several years with the explicit intention of funding white supremacist and anti-government movements, and they believed if they attacked crucial government installations that they would force the government to have to reckon with them. In 1995, the core members got drunk and filmed a recruitment video. in which they are seen toting the Turner Diaries of all things. Some of the documents found just before McVeigh's death showed that the FBI suspected McVeigh participated in a December 1994 Ohio bank robbery with the ARA, and Terry Nichols also believed that McVeigh was robbing banks with them. On October 20th, 1993, McVeigh wrote a letter to his sister Jennifer saying that he had met, quote, a network of friends who share my beliefs. At the time, McVeigh's whereabouts were unknown for 9 of the first 10 ARA bank jobs. A later letter sent from McVeigh to his sister in the year leading up to the bombing also indicates his affiliation, along with money that he said that he had gotten from a heist. A man named John Schultz, who was a protected informant working for the FBI while living in Elohim in 1994, told agents in 1997 that he was sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that he saw McVeigh in Elohim City in 1994 at a meeting about a mysterious delivery and the use of a Ryder truck. The man who first inspired the Midwest bank bandits, Mark Thomas, also told agents after his arrest that he had thought some of the members in his gang played a role in the Oklahoma City plot, but later recanted. The bank robbers in the Midwest bank robbery spree were eventually brought to justice in 1997, although after accounting for seized and spent money amongst the crew, there was as much as $250,000 in robbery proceeds left unaccounted for. And while investigating the bank robberies, the FBI found blasting caps that had been stolen from the Marion Quarry by McVeigh and Nichols and were also used in the Oklahoma City bombing. They also found the ID of Roger Moore, which was very likely taken along with his wallet when he was robbed. And then there's Chevy Kehoe and the Mueller family. Both Kehoe and the Muellers resided in Elohim during the alleged planning of the Oklahoma City bombing and the bank robbery spree. Kehoe was not a bank robber, but he did sell guns to the ARA during this time, and the Mueller family was privy to the goings-on. After the bombing in 1996, there were suspicions that the Mueller family may speak out against the ARA's connection with the terrorist attack, so the ARA commissioned Kehoe to put them down. Chevy Kehoe murdered William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and his 8-year-old daughter Sarah before robbing them of their things and throwing their bodies in an Arkansas lake. After the bombing and the release of the John Doe No. 2 sketch, thousands of leads poured into the FBI and a pattern emerged. In nearly all credible accounts, there was a matching description of a man with olive skin and dark hair. These accounts ranged from the day of the attack to the renting of the Ryder truck and even months leading up to the event. One of them comes from a landlord at a real estate group in Cassville, Missouri on November 12, 1994. He met with Terry Nichols and a dark-skinned man who said his name was Robert Jacks. They were inquiring about renting a place that had a cave on the property. During the meeting, a third man walked in, later identified as McVeigh, who hurried his friends up. It was a potential hideout spot for McVeigh to go after the bombing. It would seem as though Andreas Strassmeyer was involved in some way, and after Carol Howe's story emerged, the INS put out a notice that he was wanted for questioning, after which his lawyers snuck him out of the country through the southern border and back to Berlin. But Carol Howe had been leaking information on Strassmeyer for months at this point, and it seemed there was a willingness by authority to ignore his crimes, leading some to believe he was a protected informant or asset of some kind. And as I said before, his roommate in Elohim City was Michael Brescia, who also seemed to get somewhat favorable treatment from the authorities. And it's very likely that these two men were the ones seen with McVeigh in Lady Godiva's strip club leading up to the bombing. Many believe John Doe No. 2 was Michael Brescia, and he does bear a resemblance to the sketches. Another man who has been brought up as the possible John Doe No. 2 is Jose Padilla, a man infamous for his later attempts to commit an act of terror using a dirty bomb. Padilla's connections to McVeigh are much thinner, and his links to terrorism are through Islamic extremism, not white supremacy. Interestingly enough, he does have more direct ties to Osama bin Laden, as well as Islamic extremists in the Philippines, where Terry Nichols went to get his mail-order bride and visited several times after. I only really bring him up because he is a dead ringer for the sketches of John Doe number 2. Aside from the strange assertions that McVeigh provided to people like his sister, Nichols, and his death row roommate David Paul Hammer, which I mentioned earlier, a few other interesting details suggest a possible government cooperation. From 1991 to 1993, the FBI conducted an ambitious infiltration program codenamed PACCON, short for Patriot Conspiracy. The plan was to use veterans to infiltrate the militia groups across America who were starting to pick up momentum at the time. They would get in close and orchestrate events that would discredit the group or draw disapproval from the public. The operation was effectively buried, only coming out 17 years later when a reporter came across documents from a FOIA request. And after the clandestine operation got a bit of publicity, the FBI came out to say the project was essentially a flop and that it had nothing to do with OKC. But it's hard to deny if it was a part of the attack, it would seem that it did its job pretty well. The tragedy on April 19, 1995, also provided new life to the controversial Omnibus Counterterrorism Act of 1995. The bill, introduced by Joe Biden just 2 months before the bombing, would have allowed police broad new powers to use secret sources and secret evidence in terrorist proceedings. Widely denounced as an affront on civil liberties, the bill was languishing in committee, but that all changed on April 19th. And then there's all the reports of the other bombs.
They have found a second explosive device of some kind inside this building.
Justice Department is reporting that a second explosive device has been found.
One device was deactivated. Apparently there's another device.
In fact, 2 different explosive devices were found in addition to the one that went off.
The first bomb that was in the federal building did go off. It did the damage that you see right there. The second explosive was found and diffused. The third explosive that was found, and they are working on right now as we speak, I understand, both the second and third explosives, if you can imagine this, were larger than the first.
The medical teams downtown are unable to get into the wreckage to retrieve more of the injured because of the presence of other bombs in the air.
I just took a look down the street at the Murrah Building again. I see another bomb truck going, so apparently they're going to try to get out that third bomb.
Second bomb was found on the east side of that building. A bomb squad is on the scene.
And then there's the troubling story of Sergeant Terrence Yeekey. Yeekey was on scene that day and bravely charged into the debris to save anybody he could. Just a few hours into the rescue effort, he stopped to call his wife. Crying, he said, "It's not true. It's not what they're saying. It didn't happen that way." After the phone call, he rushed back into the carnage. Terrence Yeekey continued to do whatever he could to help for hours, late into the night in fact. He dug into the rubble looking for survivors until his fingers were bare and bleeding. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. He was put up for the Medal of Honor, which he was due to receive about a year after the incident. But Terry had been struggling with guilt that entire year. And when he saw who else was up for those medals, he wanted no part of it. He said many of the officers that were up for them were not there that day, and then he made the mistake of starting to ask questions. Whatever happened next scared him. He started to tell friends that he'd be going out of town to hide or secure evidence of a cover-up, and his then ex-wife claimed that she too began to get threats. Then he began showing up to his ex-wife's house, telling her that they needed to get remarried and that they should get a life insurance policy together. And then on May 8, 1996, just 3 days before Sergeant Yeekey was to receive the Oklahoma Police Department's Medal of Valor, he was found dead. Even though it was outside of Oklahoma City's jurisdiction, with his body being found in an El Reno field. The OKC Police Department and the FBI took over the case and quickly ruled it a suicide. According to the report, he slashed both wrists and arms a total of 11 times, before also cutting his own jugular. Then he apparently crawled for a mile through rough terrain and climbed a fence before shooting himself in the head at a downward angle. He also appeared to have rope burns on his neck and handcuff bruises on his wrists. He also had mud and grass deeply embedded in his slash wounds, something you wouldn't think to see in somebody crawling, more like somebody being dragged. Who knows exactly what Sergeant Yeekey saw? Or maybe he heard of the 2 Air Force bomb squad members who were ordered from Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico to Oklahoma City, arriving 2 days before the attack, and told to wait in a motel for a call from the FBI. Or maybe it was the suspicious call to the executive secretary's office in Washington saying that the Murrah Building had been bombed a full 24 minutes before anything happened. Or perhaps he ran into the ATF agent assigned to work Dipole Might, who just by coincidence was across the street from the Murrah Building and the federal courthouse. Dipole Might was the name given to the research project the ATF was working on in conjunction with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Defense Nuclear Agency, who were researching the creation, effects, and investigation protocol of large-scale vehicle bombs. In fact, an interesting photo taken from above Camp Gruber in Braggs, Oklahoma, just 2 weeks before the bombing, associated with Dipole Might, shows a Ryder truck parked out back. And the Defense Department would confirm the photo to be authentic, but to have nothing to do with the Oklahoma City bombing. An identical Ryder truck would be spotted at Geary Lake on April 11, 1995 by a witness, several days before the official story says it was to be constructed there. So maybe there's just a lot of coincidences. Timothy McVeigh's execution was an odd one. He fought on death row not to have an autopsy after his death, and this request was granted. His execution got a lot of media attention, and many claim that he seemed cool, calm, and collected before the event. But that wasn't the only odd thing. He got the lethal injection and then was pronounced dead. But multiple accounts seem odd. One of the witnesses, Susan Carlson of WSLA Radio, said that he seemed to be breathing or even shallow breathing after he was pronounced dead, and his eyes remained open through the duration of the procedure. After the execution, prison officials admitted to using a decoy car when transporting his body to a funeral home before having him cremated and giving his ashes over to an attorney. It's not necessarily rare to use a decoy car to transport a prisoner, but this is usually to protect his or her life, and seems a strange procedure to take when transporting a body. So I leave you today with all these strange occurrences and coincidences and ask, do you believe the official story? If you're still here, I want to thank you for sticking with me through one of the deepest dives I've ever taken. If you learned something today, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. There'll be plenty more content to come, don't you worry. And before I get out of here, I want to thank my patrons, the real MVPs. Buckethead, Tang, Shane Stangy, Low Quality Music Productions, Ensign Tour, Murray Dubs, Paul B, and Jacob Cruz. Thank you all. And to the rest of my subscribers, thank you for your patience while I put this one together. And with that, Manic out.